Love me tender, love me true.
You need to stop singing. We got a video to do today, and it's all about tendering.
You know, that's a good topic that we're going to talk about today, tendering. We get lots of questions about it. And I think we should start out with, what is a tender?
Yeah, because, you know, people that have never cruised before don't understand when they hear the term tendering or tender boat. All they know is they're going on a cruise and they're on a cruise ship. A tender boat is a small boat that transports cruise passengers from the main cruise ship through the water into port.
Now, very often they use lifeboats to tender passengers, but they also have, some ports have dedicated tender boats right there.
Right, and that's actually, we've experienced both of those because normally when tendering happens, it's the ship's lifeboats, and they're rather small, and they only have a certain amount of people they can hold, and they're a little cramped. Now, there was one cruise we were on where I was actually able to tender into port because the tender boat used was from the port location, and it was a double-decker boat. It was large, and that upper deck, they were able to wheel my wheelchair over the ramp into the upper level, so I was actually able to go into port on that stop.
Now, why do they use tender boats?
Well, they use tender boats for actually a couple of reasons. Number one, maybe the waters are so shallow that the ship can't get close to the port. Now,
shallow water would be like 30 feet to 30 feet or 9 meters. Shallow.
Yeah, and the big ships
really
the big ships cannot get to port. Another instance is if the actual port doesn't have a dock.
Now that happened to us, and I don't know, it happened to us when we were traveling and we were going to Tortola.
Right, that first trip, only you got to go.
Yeah, because it was a tender boat, and they tendered using the lifeboats, and then the second time, they had a dock built.
And I got to go to Tortola. So that was exciting. And then a possible third issue might be if your cruise ship is a little off schedule.
Oh, yeah.
And you didn't arrive at that next port destination, and another cruise ship took your spot in the docking area.
That happens a lot in Alaska.
Yeah. Your ship, because it was a little late, might have to stay out in the water, and again, you might have to tender in.
Now let's talk about tendering ports versus docking ports. Like, how would we know? How would they know if it's a tender port or a docking port?
Pretty much it's on your reservation as to whether your port destination is going to dock or whether it's a tender. Now,
like you said, unless
there's
the aforementioned there are issues.
Now, we're going to be on an NCL cruise on the Escape September 2019, and we're doing that New England, Canada cruise. I'm so excited. But one of the port stops is a tender port for every cruise ship.
And that's because it's very shallow in the port area.
Yep.
So it will be a tender only, and it delineates that on our reservation.
Yep. So I'm very upset about that. So I'm going to have to stay on the ship while you go in.
Now, a lot of people ask us questions about tender tickets. Will I need a ticket? And how will I know if I need a ticket?
Right.
And why in the world would I need a ticket?
Well, first of all, you're going to know if you need a tender ticket or not because you are going to read your ship's newsletter, okay? The day before, your cabin steward is going to drop off the newsletter for the following day, and it's going to tell you that you're going to be in such and such a port, and whether and it's a tender, reminding you it's a tender port, and whether you need tickets or not, because there's only a certain amount of people that they can get to and from ship and port and back. And so it's important that they lay out exactly what time the first tender leaves.
Yep, and generally what they do is they, if you've booked a shore excursion in that port, the shore excursion passengers have priority, followed by the higher status passengers. Sorry, it's just the way it is.
It's hierarchy everywhere.
Yeah. And but I assure you, everyone will be able to get off that wants to get off.
Right.
It's just a matter of when they will be allowed to get off.
Because there's a certain time allowance as the tender boat leaves, how long it takes to get to port, and back and forth and back and forth. So that's all calculated.
Now, we have to talk about an issue I'm sure a lot of people are going to ask, and that is, how do you tender when you're in your wheelchair?
Oh, well, again,
and what challenges might you have?
That is a big challenge, because when the ship is using its own lifeboats, those smaller boats, pretty much most of the time, passengers are going to have to walk down like 12 to 15 steps to that moving, wobbly, in the water tender boat. So that's what you're going to have to do. Now, I'm in a wheelchair. That's not going to happen. So unless they're using a port boat that has two levels that they can roll me on, yeah.
And generally, wheelchair accessible cruise tenders are not all that common.
They are not at all.
We find that on some of the private islands, like Carnival's private island, Holland, and it's shared by Holland America, and they have the type of tender needed for a wheelchair user.
And also, you have to worry about getting down those steps. Whether you're
once you've tendered in,
elderly, if you're going with children.
Now I know in Punta Cana,
if
you were able to have tendered, we would have gotten there, and you wouldn't have been able to get onto Punta Cana because you had to step up from the tender boat, and then there were steps to get into Punta Cana itself.
So those guests with mobility issues, whether it's a cane, a walker, scooter, wheelchair, you really need to investigate exactly how you're going to get there if it's a tender port. Because again, maybe we were able to get on the tender boat at the ship, but when you arrive in port, getting actually off that tender boat into shore could be a totally different scenario.
And I also want to tell everybody to take the information with a grain of salt that you get if you just call the 800 number. You're going to need to call the special needs department for whatever cruise line you're sailing with, because they will have the most current information. However, as we have found in our many travels, sometimes corporate's information is different from the information provided by the ship, because ultimately the ship is run by the captain and the special needs officer on that ship. So if they say scooters aren't going on tenders, then scooters are not going on tenders.
Or they say, you know, we can't, our crew cannot carry you in your wheelchair downstairs onto a tender boat. It's just not going to happen.
Now, there are limitations very often when it comes to tendering when you have a mobility device, such as a wheelchair. And usually you have to check the weight restriction. So it has to be your weight plus the weight of your chair or mobility device. So check that out when you're interested in a tender port. Now, we want to tell everybody that safety is priority one with all the cruise lines, and things to think about, like with tendering, sea conditions.
Right, now tendering can be a little rough going just on a normal, on its own, every day,
nice day
experience, because it's a small boat, big waters, moving fast.
And the bows are not deep.
Yes, and whether it's a 15-minute trip to the port, sometimes a 45-minute trip into port. It can be a little jumpy and bumpy, but what happens when things aren't so normal?
Oh, it's really bad.
Yeah.
Very choppy.
Yeah. And so there's a possibility that if there are high winds, really rough waters, the entire tendering into that port could be canceled. And no one's going in.
And then you want to, again, consider mobility. Will you be able to step into the tender? Will you be able to step out of the tender with or without assistance? Right. And so the higher the likelihood that you'll be allowed on the tender will be how mobile you are. Right. And we already talked about the weight of the chair and the person. So why don't we go to some tips that we had?
Yeah, let's shoot some bullet point, boom, 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 tips for you on tendering.
So tip number 1, your cruise reservation should tell you whether you dock or tender in.
I know. Number 2, usually there are steps down again to the tender boat and a gap in between the deck and the tender boat. So be careful as you're crossing over that nobody gets stuck or trips.
Number 3, a guest mobility is a major factor in whether you'd be allowed to tender or not.
That's right. Number 4, tendering back and forth can take a variety of times, from 15 minutes to 45. Who's to say? Find out.
Number 5, a limited number of guests on each boat is allowed. So make sure if there's tickets that are required that you have one.
That's right. The little lifeboats from the ship are small and cramped. The port ones tend to be a little larger and more airy. But the next tip is the tender ride into port, again, depending on weather, could be rough riding. So take some medicine if you need to and a little snack to settle your stomach.
Number 7, tendering into port may be canceled due to bad weather. So be positive and go with the flow. If you've got bad weather and you can't tender, check your daily papers and also listen to the announcements, because the ship will adjust their schedule of activities if they're not able to tender.
Fun times.
They want you to have fun.
Will be had. Many cruise lines will have tents. Oh, I love this one. Tents set up at the port. So when you're done during the day shopping in port, you're ready to tender back to the ship. A lot of cruise lines have their tent set up, seating area, cool refreshments, cold towels to wipe your sweaty brow.
I always take advantage of that. Pushing this guy around the island can be taxing. Number 9, always know the time the last tender departs from the port to get to the ship. Pay attention.
That's right.
You don't want to miss the ship.
Because that last one leaves, that is it.
You'll be screwed.
Right. And please, wear a wrist watch and set it to the ship's time. Your cell phone, if that's what you're relying on, might not be set properly to the location of your port.
And remember, be aware of specific items that you cannot bring back to the ship from your port. And that could be anything from liquor, open bottles of water, foods.
Fruits and vegetables, not good. So, contamination is a big issue.
These are all things to consider if you are tendering to and from your port.
So we've hoped that today we've given you a little food for thought and what tendering is all about.
We want to thank you for joining us today. And as always, we want to remind you to
travel safe
and cruise often.